Okay.
All right. Oh, I guess we'll get started. Hey everyone, welcome to today's Professional Development Lunch Talk. Today we're just going to be talking about Hispanic Heritage Month and Disability Awareness Month and kind of just going over what those mean, why they're celebrated, and then some case studies just to kind of be aware of different situations.
So Hispanic Heritage Month is traditionally celebrated from September 15th to October 15th. And those first few days are especially significant since September 15th is the anniversary of independence for Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. And Mexico celebrates theirs on September 16th, and then soon after, Chile celebrates theirs on September 18th. So this month is really meant to commemorate all of the history, culture, and extensive contributions from Hispanic Americans that have ancestors from Spain, Mexico, Latin and South America, and the Caribbean. But unfortunately, and all too often, as is the case for many other heritage and awareness months, organizations tend to put on a temporary profile photo or a temporary social media frame that commemorates these months. They share some really basic information, and then that's kind of where it stops. They don't really make any more efforts towards trying to enact changes that could really help with equity. So I'm sure some folks have heard of a few different group names or variations to this Heritage Month. So the term Hispanic started being used around 1975 to identify Spanish-speaking Americans. And this was really a time when our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were going through forced assimilation. So in some areas, people who spoke Spanish were being discriminated against, harmed, and schools were even mandating no Spanish speaking at home. So Hispanic is a language-centered term which refers to people who speak Spanish or are descended from Spanish-speaking populations. And this includes Spain, but it excludes Brazil because the primary language there is Portuguese. And then Latin is a geography-centered term which refers to people who are descended or from people in Latin America, which includes Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. So in this case, it does include Brazil, but it excludes Spain since it's not located in Latin America. And then the term Spanish only refers to people from Spain. And as you can see in like the middle green part, there's a really big overlap between Hispanic and Latin. So Hispanic and Latin are what you can consider these large umbrella terms, but the term Latin has a lot more subtle variations. So Latino is masculine, Latina is feminine, Latinx is the most gender inclusive term, and Latine is the most language inclusive since it's more speakable in the Spanish language and is also more recognizable when speaking to other Spanish speakers outside of the US. So nowadays, many folks don't find the term Hispanic to be reflective of themselves and our community, in part because it's due to colonization. So Hispanic was derived from the word España, which is the Roman name for what is now Spain and Portugal. And the colonization and attempted genocide of indigenous peoples there resulted in many Latina people today being of mixed race. So the term Hispanic can be viewed very often as kind of a negation of our ancestry and both the indigenous and African history. So growing up, I know I didn't know about all these different variations of Latin. It was assigned by sex primarily. So men were referred to as Latinos and women were referred to as Latinas. And then the entire group of people was often referred to as Latinos because the Spanish language deferred to masculine in this case. So I found the term Hispanic primarily and sometimes Latino to be used mostly in the academic setting and spaces, not so much in like day-to-day life, since there are so many different countries and cultures that get lumped in together. But outside of academia, I've seen a lot more folks identify themselves by the country that they're from or descendants of. So a few takeaways and important reminders are that these identifiers really aren't one size fits all. It's completely okay to ask someone what they prefer to be called or to go by. And just to keep in mind that if you do ask, you should try and remember to catch yourself using the wrong identifier, or just try to make a mental note to use what they prefer in the future. And it's also possible that folks' identifiers may change, especially with Latinx and Latina gaining more traction as of late. And then lastly, you might notice that some folks identify as Afro-Latino or Indigenous, and that's just a reminder because colonization has affected a lot of these cultures.
Okay, so now we'll talk about Disability Awareness Month. It's held during the month of October, so it's happening this month. It's celebrated to raise awareness about disabled people and their access to fair and equal opportunities, specifically employment opportunities, but lately it's kind of just become more about opportunities in general. Just some statistics to kind of break down what disability looks like in the United States. 26% of adults in the US live with some kind of disability. That's a little bit more than 1 in 4. 2 in 5 people over 65 years of age, 1 in 4 women, and 2 in 5 Indigenous people live with a disability in the United States. That's a significant number of people. And approximately 20% of students in college have a disability. So as you can see, that's not a small number of people in our population. A significant portion of people in the United States lives with a disability. So kind of just to touch on language for the disabled community, there are 2 types of language that you can use when referring to an individual with a disability, person first and identity first language. Person first language puts the person before the diagnosis. So for an example, a person with disabilities would be person first because we're putting the person first in the language. The other is identity first language, which puts the diagnosis before the person. So the example of that would be disabled person. So which of those is correct? It depends on what a person prefers. And again, it is just reemphasizing this idea that it is definitely okay to ask what someone prefers, and just making sure that you stick to that and make a mental note about it. Person first was created and intended to avoid marginalization or dehumanization. But it can also be seen as a kind of erasure or minimization of a person's experiences. And people take pride in their identity, so they could prefer identity first. But there are people who do prefer person first because they want to be seen as a person, not a diagnosis. But like I said, it's important to ask people what they prefer and do your best to use that. There's a really overarching trend in the disabled community of identity first language, but there are still people who prefer person first. So like I said, always just important to ask. And with kids, especially, this means asking the child directly. It's not what their parents prefer. It's not what their teachers prefer. It's what they prefer. So it's important to directly ask the child and adhere to that. And just a nice little resource to have is the Disability Language Style Guide, which is linked in the slides. If you're ever going to be writing about people with disabilities or the disabled community, you can refer to this style guide and it tells you which specific instances you should use which language, because for different kinds of disabilities, there are preferences within those subcommunities. And so this Disability Language Style Guide kind of helps make those preferences known. So it's a really good reference whenever you're writing about people with disabilities. All right, so now we're going to look at some case studies and have a roundtable discussion of what we would do in those situations.
All right, so the first case study we have here is a hypothetical situation where a university is looking to hire a new professor. And so let's just go through it. So your department is looking to hire a new tenure track faculty member that will help raise its research profile and teach either introductory level or graduate level courses. Each prospective candidate is required to submit a diversity, equity, and inclusion, or a DEI statement as a part of their application. So the faculty hiring committee has narrowed the applicant pool to include 2 candidates of similar educational backgrounds, Josephina and Timothy. As a part of the committee, you have reviewed their application packets and noticed that while they seem to have similar professional standing, that is equal amounts of publications, teaching experience, and grants, Josefina's DEI statement was very detailed and action-driven, but it had some grammatical errors that would typically be exhibited by an academic who is not a native English speaker. Timothy's DEI statement was more generic in comparison, but both candidates met with the students, and the committee received an overwhelmingly positive response to Josefina, whereas only half of the students who met Timothy really enjoyed the experience and his demeanor. So the question for the audience is, what would you try to talk to the candidates about, and what would you ask them if given the opportunity? The committee has reconvened to make closing statements, and there are different points of view shared. One member says, I think Josefina can connect with the students in a way that Timothy hasn't shown yet. She seems to understand a lot of the barriers they have to go through. A second member responds with, okay, sure, but if we hire a diversity candidate with broken English, we are passing by on an opportunity to add a true academic to the department. Some members nod in agreement and others seem frustrated. So our second question is, how do you respond as a member of this hiring committee to what was just said? So I guess we should probably just go through and discuss our main takeaways for this and what we think should be the inclusive and equitable response to these questions. So do you guys want me to start or?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I think the main point that we're trying to convey with this case study is that even though Timothy, even though one of the members of the committee said that Timothy was quote unquote a real academic, when you look back at it, we said Josefina and Timothy both have similar educational backgrounds. So that's not, that statement that that member made was not entirely fair. And Josefina is not just a diversity candidate. She also has the educational background required for the job. It's just that member was focusing too much on what he called broken English, which is unfairly judging her because English is not her native language. So, so that member's statement is unfair to Josefina. And when we look back at the other things about each candidate, she was much more engaging to the students and had a much more positive response in that department, whereas Timothy was more mixed, and his DEI statement was more generic. So in this case, we were looking to get the response that Josefina would be the better candidate in this scenario, just overall.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think as far as like the second question, how I would respond, I would try to push back and say, well, why are you making this claim that like, one person is a diversity candidate and the other one is like a true academic? And point back to what you were talking about, Michael. And then, I don't know, I guess like if I was a student and I had an opportunity to meet with them, I would ask about like what types of students they've been able to work with and how that experience has been for them. I would hope that like we would get some information about like what their background is in so we could ask more specific questions, but I don't really know why Timothy would have like a 50-50 split almost. I know of other situations where sometimes like a white male candidate only pays attention to like other white male students and just like ignores all the women. So I imagine that might be a possibility. But yeah, I would just try to like point back to the facts and say, well, no, they're like equal candidates and one person also connected way more with the students. So that seems like the stronger candidate to me, at least.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so I guess we'll move on to this next case study then. Okay.
Hey, so our next case study kind of focuses on advocating for disabled students. So you're a professor at a university who also acts as an academic advisor for students in your department. One of your students, Amy, has a learning disability and has academic accommodations of extra test taking time. The Office of Disability Services, or ODS, gives students a letter to distribute to professors explaining their accommodations. Amy comes to you one day and says that she tried talking with one of her professors about her accommodations and gave him the letter from ODS, but the professor said that the exams are short and most students usually finish within 30 to 45 minutes, even though there's 60 minutes for the exam, so she really won't need the accommodations. Amy tried to tell the professor that she would still like her accommodations granted just in case, but the professor said she really won't need them and refused, and he won't budge. So how can you help advocate for Amy in this instance?
I think one thing that you could do is try to go back to the head of the Disability Services Department or even the chair of this college itself and see if they can advocate for you and possibly override the professor's decision to give those accommodations.
Yeah, so ODS is a really good resource. There's one here at Mason for students with disabilities. So if you are in a situation where you notice a student is experiencing something like this, or you are a student experiencing something like this, you can contact ODS directly and they will intervene and kind of tell the professor that your accommodations need to be granted, because under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you are entitled to those accommodations and no one can try to take them away from you. So yeah, approaching ODS, that's really good. But another thing that maybe the advisor could possibly do is email the professor directly, just professor to professor, and say, hey, listen, like, I understand that this is something that's going on, that you kind of like are having this issue with this student. Just so you know, by ADA, the student is required to have these accommodations granted. And another good thing to do with that would be to CC someone from ODS, because students have a disability services like academic advisor, and so getting them involved in the conversation as well, so that there's kind of a record of everything if you decide to take the initiative and talk to the other professor. But yeah, pretty much just getting someone to talk to the professor about this, because Amy tried, but he just won't listen. So getting higher powers involved is kind of what we're looking for here.
Okay, great. Well, was there anything we wanted else we wanted to mention on this one, or?
Oh yeah, I had one thing I wanted to mention, just for the record. This is actually this experience, which I'm willing to mention, is that this actually happened to me. I had a concussion my second year of college, and one of my professors refused to allow me to do, some assignments on paper, since I couldn't do them on, on the computer because of my concussion. And while this was at a different university, I've also, talked to some of the people at ODS at George Mason, and that office exists for exactly this reason. So just for anybody else who might be listening to this after we post the recording, please do talk to them. They're great. They will help you, since that is the exact reason why they exist. Just to add.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Renee. Yeah, the whole reason I created this case study is because this has also happened to me. This is not an uncommon thing for disabled students to face. People in academia kind of tend to be sticklers for how things are done, and sometimes see these accommodations as unfair advantages, when in reality, it's just leveling the playing field. And so, yeah, this is not an uncommon occurrence for students with disabilities, but that is exactly why ODS is there, like Raina said, is to step in these situations.
I'll just add one point and then we can move on. I wonder, like, how often like an ODS representative comes to the departments to talk about this, because I know like when I was a GTA, we were told and we were kind of given like, okay, this is what you need to do if you receive a letter, whether the student hands it to you in person or if it's through email, you have to like act on it immediately. So maybe something as like kind of a refresher course, or like having someone come and talk would also be useful to like establish that norm in the department. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be really good to have like professor to professor try to handle it. But I mean, that's what ODS is there for. So they both sound like really good options.
Yeah, exactly. And what I really like about that idea is when that creates lasting change, kind of having people come in and talk about it. So yeah, exactly. All right, cool. So then our final case study is about creating an equitable workplace. So you are introduced to a new coworker, Sumita, who is a wheelchair user. You're chatting with some other coworkers at lunch one day, and your peer, Ron, remarks that Sumita probably only got the job so the company could have a token disabled person. Your other coworkers laugh, but you feel uncomfortable. What can you do in this situation? And the second part is you work on the first floor of your office building, as does Sumita. At the end of a meeting, your boss offhandedly asks Sumita to run some papers up to the second floor, but you remember that your building doesn't have elevators, it only has stairs. The company stated a plan to put in some 2 years ago, but they still haven't acted on it and nothing has really been done about the elevator situation. So what can you do in this situation? And is there anything that you can do that will create lasting change?
Am I wrong, or is it illegal to not have elevators, especially like it sounds like this is like a big office or institution?
You are 100% correct. It is illegal to not have elevators in the building. Absolutely. And so what you can do in that situation is you can actually file a report with the government to have them come do an ADA inspection of the building. And if they find out that, you know, the company's in violation of this law, they have to change it as soon as possible. So yeah, good catch.
As far as the first part of the situation goes, I think in that case, you should talk to Sumita about it and see how she feels. And if it makes her uncomfortable to be talked about that way, which I feel like it would, then personally, I think you should tell your other coworkers not to talk about her in that way and that it makes her feel uncomfortable. And that, you know, it's just because she's disabled, that doesn't mean she is the company's token disabled person. Disabled people are just as able to perform some jobs as others. So it's not like she was being hired just because she was disabled.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely making the point that Sumita is just as qualified for this job as anyone else. I think that's really important to just really reinforce that idea. Something that I like to do in situations like this is kind of flip it back on people who make comments like this and ask them why they think it's okay to say that, or like what their thinking is behind that. Because sometimes people are ignorant and they just think that what they're saying is fine. But whenever you kind of flip the script and make them think about it for a minute, they say, oh, wow, that's like not okay to say. I'm not saying that that's something that happens often, but it's definitely something you can try in these situations because it kind of reverses it a little bit and makes them kind of have to introspect and be a little bit uncomfortable. But another thing that we could possibly do in the first part of the situation is to report it to HR and just get HR involved because what the people were saying was just not okay and not appropriate for the workplace at all or just ever. So getting HR involved for that as well, just kind of escalating it up is another solution. Yeah, as for the second one, I personally, after the meeting has kind of like dispersed out, I would approach Sumita and ask if, you know, I can help run the stuff up to the second floor because there's no elevator. And obviously the boss is not really caring about that. And so just offering a hand there so that Sumita doesn't get in trouble for not doing it or anything, because the boss obviously doesn't sound like a very rational human being. But yeah, then just maybe talking to your boss about getting the elevator situation fixed, or if you really just want to go and file a complaint with the government will come and inspect it, and they can just show up without like rhyme or reason. They don't have to tell them they're coming. They can just show up and say, hey, you guys need an elevator. So yeah, that would create lasting change. If you got an inspection done, the elevator has to be put in, or you just kind of pushed for it internally. But yeah. All right. Anyone have anything to add on this one?
Yeah, the only other thing I would add is I know where I work for a pretty sizable company, but in addition to HR, we actually have a sort of a disabilities office similar to what we have at Mason. So you could also, if say the company you worked for in this situation had something like that, you could report it to them. It doesn't sound like they do because they, are not even following the regulations with the elevators, but just in the case when if you had a situation like this and you do work somewhere that has sort of a watchdog in the realm of equity for people with disabilities that you work with, you could also report it to them as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic idea. And even if you don't have that, maybe potentially getting something like that started internally would be a really good idea too. Awesome.
Yeah, this makes me, I mean, Ron's statement is very bold and like extremely offensive. So it makes me think that they don't have a code of conduct. So maybe they should write one and come to an agreement as a company that, these things are not going to be tolerated. But yeah, I'm definitely on board with reporting the situation. Like I know we have the anonymous report form, so I assume there would be something similar to that, or you could just go talk to the HR person, like you were saying.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, I guess if we don't have anything else to add, I guess that's it for this professional development talk. So thank you all for coming. And if you're watching this later on YouTube on the recording, then thank you for watching. And we will see you in another 2 weeks.